So all this is swirling around at the very same time that Daniel's writing a poem about the Civil Wars. There's a manuscript of it. Shakespeare's deciding to write Richard II, a very political play. And I think all of us, Hampton, Daniel, Mountjoy, Florio.
Hi everyone and welcome to Florio Cafe. Today we will talk about graves, worms and epitaphs with David Weiss. Hello David.
Hey Mary, how are you?
Hi, I'm fine. And you?
Excellent, very good.
David is a part-time instructor of English at Georgia Gwinnett College. He earned his PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham in the UK and the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford-Upon-Avon. His doctoral dissertation reassessed the relationship between the works of William Shakespeare and Samuel Daniel. Today with Weiss we will uncover a new fascinating connection between Shakespeare and Samuel Daniel. So David, first of all, who was Samuel Daniel?
Samuel Daniel was a major English poet, playwright, general author. He wrote in prose, and historian who was almost an exact contemporary of Shakespeare's. He was born a couple of years before Shakespeare and died a couple of years later. So he's the exact same period as Shakespeare and also as John Florio. At the time that he was writing, he was just as well known and especially early in his career, more highly regarded than Shakespeare. Though he was more a poet of the nobility, let's say. So he was writing poems and closet tragedies, closet drama that was more for people like Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke, and would have been read at court and among the courtiers, which probably accounts for why today he's not as well known as Shakespeare. Now, I recognize he is not Shakespeare. No one is Shakespeare except Shakespeare. But he was a very major author at the time, extremely well recognized and very influential. He wrote in a wide variety of genres. He started his career with a sonnet cycle, Delia, which was regarded as one of the greatest English sonnet cycles of the time and almost certainly influenced Shakespeare with his sonnets. He wrote a closet tragedy, the tragedy of Cleopatra, that again was an influence on Shakespeare and is regarded as perhaps the best example of a closet tragedy of the time. He wrote a number of narrative poems, The Complaint of Rosamond, which was extremely popular. Again, a Shakespeare influence on the Rape of Lucrece. He wrote a wonderful dialogue in verse called Musaphilus, a debate between a courtier and a poet about whether poetry has value or not. He wrote a long epic poem about the Wars of the Roses that we're going to be talking about in depth, the civil wars between the houses of Lancaster and York. He wrote a number of court masques. And very late in his career, he wrote a prose history of England that for decades, if not centuries thereafter, was regarded as one of the most important histories of England. So he was a very major poet at the time. Unfortunately, today he's fallen into some, he's not known, but I do certainly believe that he deserves to be much better known.
Yeah, and he was a close friend of John Florio. They first met at Oxford and then it began a long friendship. I think Daniel was Florio's closest friend, one of his closest friend. He wrote many dedications in Florio's works, and they both also were groom of the privy chambers, so they supported and influenced each other during their careers.
Yes, definitely. They were great friends throughout their life. As you say, perhaps best friends, or Daniel was certainly one of Florio's best friends. They met at Oxford, and from that that was when Florio was an Italian tutor there.
Yeah.
And Daniel had done a translation of an Italian work on emblems. So certainly they would have worked together on that. Daniel contributed a verse to one of Florio's first works there. But that friendship, as you say, continued for many, many years. And so, for instance, Daniel wrote a dedicatory poem in Florio's translation of Montaigne, where Daniel referred to Florio as his, quote, brother. Now, that's quite a speculation that Daniel may have married his Florio's sister. It's never been well documented, but certainly they were extremely close throughout their lives.
Can you give us a brief introduction of Richard II and the period in which Shakespeare wrote it?
Absolutely. So Richard II is today regarded as one of Shakespeare's great plays, perhaps his greatest history, alongside Henry IV, Part 1, which created Falstaff. But Richard II is just a beautiful lyrical play and an important, deep emotional work. It marked a major shift in Shakespeare's career. It was written around 1595. In fact, we believe it was written 1595 or later. I'll get into the dating of it in a little while, because it relates specifically to Daniel's poem, the civil wars between the houses of Lancaster and York. But it was written around 1595, and it was written probably in a year and a half or 2 years alongside Romeo and Juliet and Midsummer Night's Dream. So think about this. In a period of maybe a year and a half, Shakespeare writes one of the greatest history plays ever written. At that stage, probably the greatest history play ever written. An incredible tragedy, Romeo and Juliet, and one of the greatest comedies ever written, Midsummer Night's Dream. It's just staggering. I mean, this was a launch from him being a popular playwright who had written some good plays and popular works that he'd be known for today if that was it. But certainly he wouldn't be Shakespeare. But that really launched him into a whole different realm of literary genius. And Richard II is, I believe, the leading edge of it, a mature play that can stand alongside Hamlet as among his greatest works. So what would have given rise to that in 1595? Well, I think there are a number of things going on there. Number one, and probably the most important, the acting company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, had just been formed at that time in 1590, late 1594, 95. And Shakespeare was a part owner, the principal playwright, one of the actors, so a sharer. So all of a sudden there's this new acting company. And this was after a period of about 2 years where, for the most part, the theaters were closed because of plague. So they really needed plays, and Shakespeare had his good friends to write for. So he wrote some of the greatest works in English literature for that group. It also followed during that 2 years when the theaters were mostly closed. Shakespeare wrote 2 long narrative poems. The first, Venus and Adonis, and the second, Rape of Lucrece, both wonderful works. Yes. And both were dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. Now that's going to be critical for much of the discussion we're going to have about Daniel and Florio and Southampton. So Shakespeare was potentially connected there. When I say potentially, there's not a lot of documentation of what relationship Shakespeare might have had with Southampton, but we do know this. In 1593, he dedicated the first poem to Southampton, Venus and Adonis. Yeah. It had a very formal dedication to Southampton. Unlikely he would have met or really known Southampton. He was begging for favor, effectively. Exactly. By the time of the second poem, it had a much more familiar dedication. Yeah. And it's unlikely.
Confidence, too.
Yeah. It's unlikely he would have written another poem had he not gotten approval to do that, probably gotten pay. There's some speculation that Southampton may be the young man of the sonnets. Yeah. We don't know that. I'm not going to get into whether the sonnets are biographical or not.
I think Sterling Wells has lately published a book about Shakespeare's sonnets, and he has proposed that actually those sonnets for the young boy were actually written for Southampton.
Yes. It certainly may be. I mean, to whatever extent they are biographical, Southampton is almost certainly the leading candidate for that. Although another candidate is the young William Herbert, the son of Mary Sidney.
Yes.
all of whom have connections to Daniel and to Shakespeare, and I'll get into some more of those. So Shakespeare writes Richard II after this period of dedicating 2 poems to Southampton. He's now getting a little more involved in the literary world of the nobility, the world that Samuel Daniel is closely connected to. And it's thought, had he not gotten back involved in the theater, maybe that's the route he would have gone. But the Lord Chamberlain's men, thank God for us, took him in the direction of drama. But here's another point that I think I need to make about Richard II. In addition to being a more emotionally mature work, something very poetic, it is a political powerhouse. It just gets firmly into politics.
Yeah.
Central to it is the idea of the divine right of kings, an idea that had been promoted by Elizabeth and the Tudors, that kings were appointed by God and could not be displaced by man. Now, Richard II is a play about the deposition of a king. Richard II was overthrown by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. And central to the play are questions about whether or not that deposition is appropriate. And these were big topics at the time, topics that were being debated among the member of the circle that Daniel traveled in and Shakespeare would have been on the periphery of. So to me, Shakespeare was getting right into the center of those debates by writing Richard II at that time. So hopefully that gives you enough background on Richard II.
Scholars, they all generally agree that the playwright Shakespeare used Samuel Daniel, the first 4 books of Civil Wars, okay? For Richard II. What's your research about? What did you add to this analysis that is fundamental to understand this source that Shakespeare used?
Okay, so as you say, scholars generally accept Shakespeare used the first 4 books of the Civil Wars. So let me tell you about the first 4 books of the Civil Wars a little bit. So it is the first installment of a long epic poem about the wars that we currently call the Wars of the Roses. It's called The Civil Wars Between the Houses of Lancaster and York. And Daniel was working on a very long epic poem about that. It was originally intended to be 12 books, very, very long. He never made it there. In his lifetime, he actually only did 8 of those books. But the first installment of it was called the first 4 books of the Civil Wars and was published in 1595. And that is generally regarded as the thing that best helps us date Shakespeare's play. The connections between Richard II, the echoes in Richard II from Daniel's poem, I thought are so close that it's believed Shakespeare could not have possibly written Richard II before the publication of the first 4 books of the Civil Wars. Now, I do question that, and I'll get into that in a couple of moments. But there are those close connections. Now, the first 4 books of the Civil Wars has as its center the very same issues that Shakespeare was dealing with, the deposition of Richard II, and that started effectively what we refer to as the Wars of the Roses. So they're thinking about and writing about the very same things at the same time. And as I'm sure we'll discuss, they also have a lot of common connections at that time. So they're both dealing with the politics of what's going on. What my thesis said is that as opposed to current scholarly consensus, which is basically Daniel did not know Shakespeare or really even of Shakespeare, this is what's believed, and Shakespeare just happened to pick up, upon its publication, the first 4 books of the Civil War, said, I'll pick up some of that stuff and put it into my play, alongside with my other sources, Holinshed and Hall's Chronicle. So fine, it's just sort of a casual relationship. My doctoral thesis speculated, and I tried to prove there was a much closer relationship between the works. And I'm emphasizing it's the works, not necessarily the people. It's tough to get down to, and we'll get at some of the personal connections, but it's much more that the works are closely engaged with each other. So they're dealing with the same issues and dealing with them in different ways. So I believe Shakespeare is reacting to, specifically, the politics that Daniel was putting into the civil wars. And his play, therefore, becomes part of the political debates of the time. And one of the things that I do in my doctoral thesis is demonstrate that Shakespeare may have used an early manuscript of the Civil Wars. There are two existing early manuscripts of the Civil Wars, one of the first two books, another of the third book. And I date them to 1594, not 1595. So for one thing, if that's true, Shakespeare could have written Richard II in 1594, not 1595, so it changes the date. Much more importantly, it changes the nature of the relationship between the works. If Shakespeare was working with a manuscript, had gotten access to a manuscript, it makes those works much more closely related than just sort of casually, I'll pick up a couple of elements of the first four books of the Civil Wars in my play. So that's really central to my thesis. And in addition to my doctoral thesis, I ended up publishing an article in a journal, Huntington Library Quarterly, and it's titled, "Did Shakespeare Use a Manuscript of Samuel Daniel's Civil Wars to Write Richard II?" This is in the summer 2020 edition of Huntington Library Quarterly. If people are interested in seeing it, it is available in full on my webpage. So there's a PDF of that whole article, so you can read some of that there.
Let's see if you agree with my view. I see it as both Shakespeare and Daniel working at their works at the same time, okay, and exchanging views and theories and opinions about their works. What do you think?
Yes, I do think there's a very good chance of that. And both we've got the textual elements of what
I think that Daniel too was influenced by Shakespeare, Richard II.
Oh yes,
you know.
I do believe that, and actually that is in my thesis. If you accept that Shakespeare used an early manuscript, and there are lots of changes between that manuscript and the final version that was published. For instance, the manuscript does not include the deposition scene of Richard II. So at some point, Daniel added that. Could that have been added after Richard II? Possibly. Now, the deposition scene is itself very complicated because it is also not in the early printed version of Richard II. This is part of it being a very hot political topic.
Yeah.
So what you really have to do is start looking closely at the works, looking at the echoes between the works to figure out what is the relationship and when did each of the either the playwright Shakespeare or the poet Daniel add it, and how could they be related? Now all this ties into that they had very close common connections at the time. So this is probably a good time to start getting into that. So let's start with that both Daniel and Shakespeare had close connections to people around what is referred to as the Essex Circle. That's the circle of courtiers and nobility that surrounded Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Now, remember, Essex, very, very well connected to the highest levels. So he was Queen Elizabeth's, quote, favorite. So what that means in a political sense is she had appointed him, for instance, to the Privy Council, the highest advisors at the time. And it's fairly well documented. He was her young boyfriend, if I can use the phrase, her young lover at the time. She was aging at this stage, so he was very closely connected to the highest levels. So people surrounding him could actually influence policy. Now, some of them were influencing policy directly themselves. At the top of that list is a guy named Mountjoy, or Charles Blount, Baron Mountjoy. He was Samuel Daniel's major supporter of the poem, The Civil Wars, the Civil War between the houses of Lancaster and York. In the poem, Daniel thanks Mountjoy for his support, and although it's not named specifically, among that support would have been getting him to work in one of Essex's homes, Wanstead, as he was working on it. There are references in the poem describing where he's working And in a later version, it pretty much confirms that that was Wanstead. And Wanstead, later in life, it was owned by Mountjoy, but at that stage, it was owned by Essex. And in part, Mountjoy was there all the time because he had a girlfriend who he later married, named Penelope Rich, who happened to be married herself at the time, and who was Essex's sister. So very well connected. So Mountjoy is Daniel's not really official patron, but I'll call it supporter. He also, Mountjoy gave Daniel access to his library. Now, Mountjoy is probably the highest level advisor in the Essex Circle. He is a fellow member of the Privy Council. He's a very good close friend of Essex. He is also a father figure to Southampton. So here we're getting into the connection.
Yeah, Southampton didn't have
a lot of connections at the time. So Southampton, who is at this very time Shakespeare's patron, and if Shakespeare ever did meet Southampton, it was almost certainly in 1594, the very period when this manuscript that I'm talking about would have been circulated. So Southampton is very close to Mountjoy. He is one of Essex's best friends. He's one of the ones who, in later years, that Essex ended up being executed for leading a bit of a revolt against Queen Elizabeth. Southampton was involved in that, was imprisoned for that. And Southampton, so he's Shakespeare's patron. He is also extremely good friends with our man, John Florio, as you know, as you've said a lot about.
Yeah.
Florio was living with Southampton at the time.
Florio, I think he
started to live with Southampton around 1591, because in Second Fruits he already mentions Henry. He mentions Henry, he mentioned that they go to theatre together, that they play tennis together. So in 1591 he already established a close relationship with him. So I think he started to be his tutor around 1590. Until at least 1598, when he dedicated a word of words to Henry, and he brought a beautiful dedication to him.
Mm-hmm. So I think he stayed with him at least like 10 years.
Yeah. So you say Henry. I don't know if we've mentioned his name. Henry Wriothesley is the Earl of Southampton.
Yeah, Henry Wriothesley.
So in this precise
Wriothesley. How do you pronounce it? Sometimes people pronounce it Wriothesley, sometimes Wriothesley.
I pronounce it Wriothesley. That's the way I've heard most people pronounce it, but we just same with Charles Blount. It's written Blount, but some people pronounce Blount. We just don't know.
Yeah, and you point out that the manuscripts of Daniel's work differ from the three books as they appear in print. Okay.
Yes. And they differ quite significantly.
Yeah, so, and they include the manuscript of Samuel Daniel include textual similarities with Shakespeare, Richard II.
Right.
And so, which are these textual similarities that you have found in your analysis, in your research, and they show the Shakespeare must have necessarily read Daniel manuscript and not the printed work?
Well, first off, I would say I wouldn't be quite as definitive as to say he must have. I personally conclude it's probable he did, certainly more likely that he did, and I'll go through a bit of that in a moment. But if you want to make your own determination, read my article, because I do leave it open a bit. So let me start with, why do we think that Shakespeare used the Civil Wars at all? Let me give you a good example of that. So this is an example that is in both the printed version and in the manuscript. So Shakespeare could have gotten it from the printed version of the manuscript. Probably the biggest thing is Daniel invented, effectively, the character of Queen Isabel, Richard's queen, as a mature woman. A woman who has a loving relationship with Richard, has a very tender parting scene. We see a lot of his difficulties through her eyes in Daniel's poem. And that completely has no historical basis. The actual Queen Isabel was 6 or 7 years old when she married Richard II. It was obviously a political marriage. She was French, so it had a lot to do with the politics between England and France. And she was 10 years old when he was captured and deposed. So we're not talking about a mature relationship here. And nowhere in the English chronicles, in Holinshed and Hall, Grafton, nowhere do you find them saying, oh yeah, she was. There's a little bit of a French chronicle which says she was very nice, but doesn't say anything about their relationship. Now, Daniel invented this relationship. And interestingly, he actually did it based on one of his principal sources for his poem, The Civil Wars, which is he was writing the English version of Lucan's Pharsalia, or it's also known as Lucan's Civil Wars, which is about the wars of Rome and Julius Caesar. In that, the hero, or anti-hero to some extent, is Pompey. And so he actually describes the relationship when Pompey returns in defeat with his wife. There are episodes in there that Daniel basically lifted and used in the Civil Wars and created the character of Queen Isabel. So that's how we know that Daniel did this, not Shakespeare, because it was one of Daniel's principal sources. Now, in like I said, in both the printed edition and in the manuscript, there's this parting scene and where Richard and Isabel are meeting for the last time. And there's a poetic conceit where she describes that they have to share their grief, that each of them, if they grieve on their own, it's not complete. But when they're together and grieving and weeping together, it's complete. And that's based on Lucan's Pharsalia. There's a similar concept in there. And let me read, if I may, a little bit of the section. So Daniel says, Isabel say, "My tears without thine are not fully tears. Join then our plaints and make our grief full grief." Now, Shakespeare has a very similar parting scene in Richard II between Isabel and Richard. Remember, no historical basis for this whatsoever. And in Shakespeare's scene, there's a line, so two together weeping make one woe. So think about that. The words are different. We're not talking about, it's not directly quoting, but do we think that Shakespeare independently invented that idea in a made-up scene with a character that sort of didn't exist and uses the same concept? Influence just seems extremely likely. So that's the sort of thing, and there are dozens of them. And by the way, I highly recommend for further analysis of this the Arden edition of King Richard II, edited by Charles Forker. Has a lot of analysis of Daniel's influence on Richard II. So that's in the printed edition and the manuscript. In the manuscript, there are a number of stanzas that Daniel ended up not printing, never printed. It was never in a printed edition. So it wasn't in the first 4 books of the Civil Wars, wasn't in later ones. In one of those, there's a stanza where Isabel, the queen again, is describing seeing Richard coming into London in defeat as Bolingbroke's prisoner. Again, a scene that has no historical basis. This is not from the sources. It didn't happen. It's not in Holinshed. So she's describing that. Now, much of that scene is in both the printed edition and the manuscript. But there is a stanza that's only in the manuscript, and this is a manuscript that exists at the British Library. I've worked with it.
And you show pictures in your analysis. There are pictures of the original manuscript that you consulted at the British Library, right?
So yes, there are pictures of the manuscript. And by the way, I don't say that Shakespeare absolutely used this manuscript. And if he used a manuscript, I don't say that it necessarily was this one. But the fact is, it's the only known existing manuscript of the first 2 books of the Civil Wars. So it's possible I touched something that Shakespeare touched. I don't do it with gloves. So it's pretty cool. Anyway, so there's a stanza where Isabel describes Richard as if he's an actor who's being ignored. That he's an actor on the stage and the Londoners are ignoring him, giving him no applause. And she says, "Was there none that with respective eye would look upon their lord? Deserved he no regard in passing by? No, not the least applause by sign or word on the stage unto this wicked act." So deserved he no applause on the stage unto this wicked act? And it talks about the eyes ignoring Richard. So remember again, this is an invented scene, and Shakespeare comes up with the idea of, or rather Daniel puts into this manuscript the idea that Richard is like an actor who is being ignored. Now, very famously, there is a scene in Richard II. This is not shown on stage, and it is not described by Isabel. Rather, it's described by the Duke of York, describing to his wife, Richard, coming into London in defeat behind Bolingbroke. And he says, as in a theater, the eyes of men, after a well-graced actor leaves the stage, are idly bent on him that enters next. Even so, men's eyes did scowl on gentle Richard. No man cried, God save him. No joyful tongue gave him his welcome home. So very similarly, York, Shakespeare's play, is analogizing Richard to an actor on the stage who is ignored. And he's describing the very same scene, an invented scene that's in Daniel. Could it be coincidence? Yes, it can be coincidence. The idea of the monarchs being actors on the stage, theatra mundi, is a relatively common idea. It was out there. It's possible. But this is in a section that Daniel invented, and there are many, many echoes in the printed edition that Shakespeare picked up. It describes Henry Bolingbroke on his horse in both versions. Yeah. It's clear Shakespeare picked it up from Daniel. So could be coincidence. I think it's more likely that Shakespeare saw the manuscript. Again, if you want to make your own assessment, take a look at my article, which is available on academia.edu.
And you have before mentioned the literary circle in that period. You have mentioned Robert Devereux, that Florio mentions in A Word of Words. Florio described the Earl of Essex as a writer who used a pseudonym A.B. And he mentions this in A Word of Words. And so we just look at, I think it's very fascinating, the social network in which Shakespeare worked. So we have Shakespeare, we have Daniel, Florio, Southampton, and the Earl of Essex.
And Mountjoy.
And Mountjoy. Do you think that possibly Florio may have been involved in writing or not?
In writing Richard II or with Daniel, do you mean? Or?
With Daniel. Because we were discussing before the fact that they were at Oxford together, they possibly
collaborated with Daniel for the translation of Giovio Imprese. Florio was a ghostwriter. He collaborated extensively with his friends, and Daniel was his closest friend. So do you think that he possibly helped, or they exchanged opinions, or that he collaborated with him in this circle that they are all connected with
each other?
Certainly, it seems extremely likely that there was some form of sharing ideas. And if there was a manuscript circulating at this time, the leading contenders for people who would have seen such a manuscript are number one, Mountjoy, the one who was supporting Daniel, and number two, John Florio. Because yes, they were extremely close friends. And if there was, and this was a beautiful manuscript, very well prepared. Oh, and by the way, in that manuscript, in addition to it existing, so it would have been written by a formal secretary, someone who actually writes out manuscripts. It's beautiful writing. But there are notations by Samuel Daniel in that manuscript. He crosses out some words and writes words above them.
So Daniel used the secretary hand or not?
He did, but he actually, when he wrote a poem to King James upon his ascension that he personally wrote out. It also is at the British Library.
Because Florio used it too. Florio used both secretary hand and Italian hand, typical Italian hand.
Yeah, although this is more of a bookhand that's in this particular manuscript. It seems like something that was even above a secretary. It's very, very fancy. You'll show some images
Yeah,
from it,
yeah,
but the title page is beautiful.
yeah.
Anyway, my point is, you were asking about Florio. Yes, I mean, such a manuscript that existed and Daniel's making changes to it, I think very, very likely that Florio would have seen it. And if Florio had it at some point in time, wouldn't he potentially share that with Southampton, the band to whom Shakespeare had dedicated 2 poems? And by the way, the Civil Wars, perhaps I'll mention this, I'll go into this a little more. In addition to having a lot on Richard II, it has whole sections on Henry V and Henry VI. So Shakespeare had written 3 plays about Henry VI, perhaps collaboratively with others, 2 of them almost definitively, mostly Shakespeare, Henry VI parts 2 and 3.
Yes.
Very much the same matter in that. So Florio, Daniel's very close friend, Hampton's very close friend. This is at the very same time, 1594. It's the time of the famous Danvers brothers' murder of Henry Long that I know you've written about.
Do you think that Southampton could promote this kind of works? Because sometimes Henry Wriothesley, he has been described a bit of, you know, just a young, beautiful boy who loved to spend his time going to theater. Lately, I have read many analyses that have rediscovered his figure also as a poet. It is possible that he too was involved in promoting this kind of works, both for Shakespeare and Daniel as well.
Yes, no, absolutely he was. And I think it's all, so yes, he was extremely well connected. I think he's a much deeper character than that image that you said is held of him. There are a couple of decent biographies of him that talk about his connections. But it's also, it all ties into the Essex Circle. And Essex himself is a figure that similarly has been held to be perhaps a little frivolous and just with grand aspirations of by sleeping with Queen Elizabeth, he could become king. But that is absolutely not the right image of Essex. And most recently, there's wonderful.
They are a bit popular. They are very popular these years. They are really.
Right.
I don't
well,
think
there's a big Hollywood movie about Elizabeth and Essex.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's out there as a popular image. But lately, there's great research on Essex. Paul Hammer has the polarization of Elizabethan politics that evaluates Essex and this very period. And so when you talk about Southampton, that he's best friends with Essex, closely connected, the Essex Circle is actively debating who should succeed Queen Elizabeth. And what is the meaning of the deposition of Richard II? Was it appropriate for others to step in and say, we're handling this? So there's a flurry of ideas that are being debated. So for instance, here's another connection that we have. There are so many swirling connections. I put it that there are far fewer than 6 degrees of separation between Daniel and Shakespeare during this period of time. So one connection is Love's Labour's Lost, which I know you've written and spoken a lot about. You regard Florio as a potential collaborator with Shakespeare, his aide. And I think that there's a fair idea of that. But one thing is certain. Love's Labour's Lost is in part about the Essex Circle. There are characters in it that are, in my mind, somewhat loving caricatures. You can regard them as ridicule, but one, for instance, is Don Armado. He is clearly based on Antonio Perez, who is the word peregrine or peregrinate is used in Love's Labour's Lost, a ghost name for Antonio Perez was Peregrine. And so Antonio Perez was a Spanish exile. He had been involved in a murder in Spain. He was being sought by King Philip of Spain, a great enemy of Elizabeth. He was Catholic. And he is living with Essex at this very time, 1594. And he writes a political treatise called The State of Christendom, that's debating about whether Elizabeth has the right to oppose Philip of Spain, which he held, of course he does. But it also means that therefore someone who is not the monarch can oppose the monarch. So buried in it are discussions of Richard II and about how it was an appropriate deposition. So you've got Antonio Perez debating this very topic. He's living in Essex. He's being parodied, I think, in a loving way. I think that Love's Labour's Lost is a very fun play. And Essex itself is probably one of the characters in Love's Labour's Lost. We've got John Florio is heavily involved with Southampton in there. I think Southampton's another one of the characters in there indirectly, one of the young men. And it's all at this very, very same time. And I know it's debated if Holofernes is Florio or not. You and I may differ on that. I think in part he is. And I don't think it's quite as negative a portrayal as it's been made out to be. But regardless, Florio is involved in Love's Labour's Lost. So all this is swirling around at the very same time that Daniel is writing a poem about the Civil Wars. There's a manuscript of it. Shakespeare is deciding to write Richard II, a very political play. And I think all of us, Hampton, Daniel, Mountjoy, Florio, are...
Do you think that this social literary circle could be crucial to understand how Shakespeare wrote some of his plays? So do you think that by looking at Shakespeare plays from a wider network might be the key to understand how he wrote them or not?
Yes. In fact, that's somewhat a central part of my overall doctoral thesis, which let me show off the big book here. Here it is, a very big book, and it's called Samuel Daniel's First Four Books of the Civil Wars and Shakespeare's Early History Plays. So by the way, as I'm showing off my props, here's Shakespeare. So he's participating in it.
I should make one of Florio too.
That's right. And here's Samuel Daniel.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful.
And I know you have your picture of Florio.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
So it's important to have props. So you say it's crucial to understand.
Are there portraits of Samuel Daniel or not?
Oh, yes,
or just engravings? Or just engravings?
This is an engraving of Samuel Daniel.
Engraving. Okay.
It's the only one that we have.
That's the only one.
It was from, this is not an original, it's a reproduction, but the original is from the Civil Wars, the front, the final version of it, it was in the front of it. So we're talking about understanding Shakespeare's plays from a different context by relating them to these
wider network of friends.
I do think it's important. So we've been talking about Richard II. And although it's known to be a political play, it becomes a much more political play if he's going back and forth with Daniel, engaging with his poem, presenting a different version of the same events. So, for instance, in my thesis, I lay out the idea that I believe Daniel took the position that it is all right to depose. It's possible to depose a king, a bad monarch, but the appropriate due process needs to be followed. And Daniel specifically points out that the due process was not followed in the deposition of Richard II because Richard never called the parliament that deposed him. In theory, parliament could depose a king, but parliament has to be called by the monarch. How does it work? It's a big open question, but that's debated in the state of Christendom. So Daniel came down on the side of, yes, monarchs can be deposed, but this one wasn't right. Wasn't done appropriately. Shakespeare, much more nebulous. He gets much more into the characters. He effectively says, yes, Richard II was not a good king. In many ways, he was a bad king, but he was an inspirational king. His poetic nature, his glory of England was really important, and something gets lost when you depose that and you move to the much more administrative manager that is Henry Bolingbroke. So to me, you understand it in a different context. You understand the play a little differently. You understand Shakespeare's composition of the play differently. Something else I get into my thesis, if you don't mind me getting into, are the Henry VI plays, which is another example of this. The Henry VI plays have often been thought of as sort of throwaways, not very, big deals, not very good plays. I think they're excellent plays. They're not Richard II, but Henry VI, parts 2 and 3 are beautiful plays.
Yes.
In my thesis, I describe how they were written for the Earl of Pembroke's men. Pembroke's men. The Earl of Pembroke was William Herbert, the husband of Mary Sidney Herbert, who Samuel Daniel was working with. She was his patron as he was writing the tragedy of Cleopatra and living at their house at the very time that they were paying for Pembroke's men to be performing the Henry VI plays. Do we think that Daniel, who's writing about Henry VI, knows nothing of the very, very popular Henry VI plays? Well, current scholarly consensus is that he didn't know anything about them. That just makes no sense. So in my thesis, I describe instances where Daniel could have encountered the Henry VI plays through Mary Sidney. Now that gives us a very different perspective on the Henry VI plays. They're now not just throwaway popular plays that were a playwright, who wasn't thinking about the politics. They become much more important. And there are echoes between the Henry VI plays and Daniel's poem. Those plays are performed well before Daniel's poem. So that may actually be the first instance of an author borrowing from Shakespeare. And Shakespeare was not very well known at the time. For instance, the relationship between the Duke of Suffolk, the lover of Queen Margaret of Anjou, is to a great extent invented by Shakespeare. There are hints about it in the chronicles, but nowhere near the extent of it. And once again, there's a big parting scene between Margaret of Anjou and the Duke of Suffolk in Shakespeare's play. There's a very, very similar one with verbal echoes of it in Daniel. So in my thesis, I describe how I believe Daniel was aware of and influenced by those plays. Those plays take on different meaning, and those plays are thought to have been revised at some time between when they were originally performed in the early 1590s and sometime later in the 1590s. Was that before Daniel's poem or after Daniel's poem? And once again, in those revisions, there are strong echoes. You've got to evaluate the relationship between the poem and Shakespeare's works.
Yeah, exactly.
The New Oxford Shakespeare lays out a theory of those poems being revised in the late 1590s. It does not discuss the relationship with the Civil War. I think it ought to. And once again, the thesis, which is also available online at academia.edu.
And what do you suggest to people who want to understand more about the relationship between Shakespeare and Samuel Daniel?
It's a great question, and it's a very difficult question.
And it's very important too.
I do believe it's very important. And Daniel, like John Florio, unfortunately, there's not a really good published works of Samuel Daniel, just as there isn't for Florio. And unfortunately, Daniel doesn't have someone like you. To John Florio or a YouTube channel. I do think about doing that.
But Daniel has you.
Well,
we have done a lot of work. You have created his Wikipedia page.
Sort of thing, and I would call it Musophilus, which is my personal favorite Daniel poem, the poem Musophilus he's done. But what Daniel does have is a Wikipedia page, a very good Wikipedia page. And I can say it's very good because, yes, I wrote most of it. As you know, because I know you've worked on John Florio's page as well. Wikipedia doesn't really have, quote, authorship. Anyone can contribute a byline in it. But if you dig behind the page, you can find who edited it and who put in various pieces. And if you dig behind the Samuel Daniel page, you'll see there's a mysterious figure called Musophilus that wrote most of it. That's me. So I can attest. I believe it's a good, well-documented page, and I just did that in the last couple of years. So I'd recommend that. It has a lot of background on Daniel, about his works, and it has a whole section on Daniel and Shakespeare in there. One of the things I'd like to work on long-term is expanding that. I'd like to work on Wikipedia pages for his individual works, like the Civil Wars or Musaphilus.
Oh, yeah, that would be great too. Yeah.
Musaphilus does have a page, but it stinks. And the Civil Wars doesn't have a page at all. So we got to get those. And Wikipedia is wonderful. I mean, it's the great way of getting the word out. I mean, a fair number of people look at my thesis or my article, but every single month, 1,000 or more views, the Wikipedia page.
Yeah, I think they are the most visited page. When you Google a name, the first page that appears is the Wikipedia. So it's very important.
Yeah, it is. Now, if you're diligent and you want to go much further than that, I do have a few suggested sources. Unfortunately, the last time a complete works of Samuel Daniel was published was the late 1800s. Those big black books up there are the complete works from the.
Who wrote them?
It was edited by Alexander Grossart. Reverend Alexander Grossart. I mean, they're by Daniel, but edited by him. And they're beautiful. They're wonderful. They were reprinted in a very limited edition in the 1960s, but there are only about 100 copies of it. So it's very tough.
So it's a rare work.
Yeah, you can go, if you go into ABE Books or Amazon and put in a search for them, occasionally versions will show up, and I do have one of those. There is similarly, let me show you, a good modernized edition of Daniel's selected works. This is called Samuel Daniel, Selected Poetry and a Defense of Rhyme, edited by Geoffrey Hiller and Peter Groves.
Who is
That's Mary City. It's Anne Clifford.
Okay.
Anne Clifford,
Yeah.
Cumberland. So it's Anne Clifford, and Daniel in later years was her personal tutor. And there's a portrait of Daniel in this painting that she had commissioned. That's her as a child. Anyway, so that's a good book, and you might be able to find that. If you look at anthologies, they'll almost have they'll almost have some Daniel. Here's a good one: Blackwell's Annotated Anthologies, 16th Century Poetry. This is good because it takes his work and puts it in modernized spelling and grammar, which a lot of the stuff doesn't. It's more for scholars, and it's in the original spelling and grammar. So that's very good. The New Oxford Book of 16th Century Verse is a good one. It has parts of Daniel. Or if you just go online and search Samuel Daniel, first thing that'll come is the Wikipedia page, but things like the Poetry Foundation, you'll find that. But right now, the easy thing is the Wikipedia page. And on that, I'd recommend my self-promotion here, my thesis or the article from Huntington Library Quarterly. And by the way, my thesis includes the entire text of the first 4 books of the Civil Wars as they were originally published. It's many pages in my thesis, and points out every single change in that between the original manuscript of the first 3 books and the first 4 books. So you can make your own determinations of what you think was done then. As far as I know, that's the first time since it was originally published 400 years ago that the text of the first 4 books of the Civil Wars, the version that Shakespeare used to write Richard II and Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and Henry V, that's the first time it's been in print. So in my ideal world, eventually I'm going to get that published, either my thesis or an edition of the Civil Wars. But I've got other things I'm working on first.
What are you currently working on?
So the biggest thing is just my regular teaching. So let me give you a little bit about my background. You mentioned that I went for my PhD at the University of Birmingham and the Shakespeare Institute. Well, one thing that's interesting about it is that I just did that in the last 10 years. So I did it later in life, in my 50s. It came after a business career, a very successful business career. So I was an accountant and ended up as the chief financial officer of a company that I took public and very fortunately retired from relatively early. So I retired from business to stay home and raise my kids and to study English literature.
Wow,
I decided to go back to school for my PhD in English to study Samuel Daniel. I found much more than I expected to find. After I got my PhD, I wasn't doing it in order to teach. But once I got it, I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to teach? Now, unfortunately, there's no demand for teaching Samuel Daniel, and there's let's say, diminished demand for teaching Shakespeare. And there are lots and lots of experts out there who can teach Shakespeare. And I'm only interested in doing it part-time. In any case, not much demand for that, but there is a huge demand to teach English composition. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm teaching English composition at Georgia Gwinnett College. And the message that I'm trying to deliver to my students who are not English majors, it's a required class, is that studying English, learning how to write, learning how to communicate, learning how to think critically, how to deal with issues that don't have clear right or wrong answers, are the things you learn in English, not in your technical classes that you're going to be studying. So no matter what you're going to do in your life, studying English is important. And this is something I can speak about with some authority because undergrad, I was both an English major and an accounting major at the University of Pennsylvania. And I went and had a business career, and I show them actual examples from my career where Shakespeare helped me make decisions, and show them how I used English in my accounting career, and it helped me advance. So that's the most important thing that I'm currently working on, and I'm really enjoying it, and I tend to continue working on it. I'd like to do something related to it, which is more directly about Shakespeare and business. I'd like to develop a course.
Yeah, that will be really fascinating.
Oh, thank you. It's a course that possibly I could offer online, but ideally I'd like to do it in person with groups of English majors and business majors, or people maybe just interested in English and interested in business, and mix them up and have discussions about Shakespeare and show how lessons, for instance, on leadership from Henry V and his motivational speeches. Of course, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. How they can impact you in the working world. So I'm working on a course like that. And by the way, on my YouTube channel, which is David Weiss, parenthetically Shakespeare, if you look that up, you can find a couple of videos about that. One is called Warriors for the Working Day, which is Henry V. And it's just a 5-minute video about the course I want to develop. And then a much longer presentation on how I use lessons from Shakespeare. It's called Why Shakespeare, and it's a presentation I gave at another school, University of West Georgia. So that's something I'm working on longer term and more longer term, ideally the Daniel stuff. So those are the things that I'm currently focusing on. And I'd love one day to have a Samuel Daniel channel called Musophilus. Just as Resolute.
Well, that would be lovely. That would be lovely.
Or have social media. I'm not nearly as good at social media as you are. So you can teach me about Twitter and Instagram and using those.
That was such an interesting interview. Haven't learned so much about Daniel, about Richard II. So thank you so much for having accepted my invitation today. Really, thank you.
Well, thank you, Mary. It's been an absolute pleasure. I love it.